The town of Greyfall had a way of keeping people. Not through warmth, not through beauty, but through the particular gravity of small places. The kind that pulls at the ankles of anyone who has ever left and reminds them, quietly and without mercy, of everything they walked away from. Cole Merritt had walked away 10 years ago, on a Tuesday morning in early October, with a duffel bag, a train ticket, and the unexamined certainty of a 24-year-old man who believed that leaving was the same thing as moving forward. He came back on a Thursday, also October. The symmetry of it was not lost on him. The town looked smaller than he remembered, which he had been told to expect and still found unsettling. The hardware store on Clement Street had a new coat of paint. The diner on the corner had changed its sign. The large oak at the center of the square had lost a major limb at some point, and the absence of it altered the skyline in a way that felt disproportionate to its size. He had not called ahead. He told himself this was because he hadn't known exactly when he was arriving. The truth, which he was only partially willing to examine, was that calling ahead would have required him to know what he intended to say. And he did not know that yet. He knew only that he had left something unfinished in Greyfall, or rather someone. Her name was Nora Voss. She had been 22 when he left. The daughter of the town's only veterinarian, quiet in the way that people sometimes mistake for shyness, until they spend enough time around her to understand that it was something else entirely. A kind of careful attention, a preference for listening over speaking, for watching over performing. They had been together for 3 years before he left, not formally engaged, though his mother had asked, and her mother had assumed. They were the kind of together that people in small towns treat as settled fact. Cole and Nora, Nora and Cole, the couple at the back table at Greyfall's one restaurant on Saturday evenings. The two figures walking the river trail in the late afternoon. He had left her with a conversation that he had always told himself was honest, and had recently begun to understand was simply convenient. He had said he needed to go, that he didn't know when he'd be back, that she shouldn't wait. She had stood at the door of her parents' house and looked at him with an expression he had spent 10 years trying to correctly interpret. Not anger, not devastation, something quieter and more difficult to name. She had said, "I know." 2 words. No performance. No plea. He had carried those 2 words further than he'd carried anything else he'd taken with him. He did not go to her house first. He told himself this was out of respect for the 10 years of silence between them. It was also, if he was being precise, because he was afraid of what he might find, or more accurately, of what might no longer be there to find. He checked into the Greyfall Inn, a 6-room establishment that had not meaningfully changed since his childhood, and walked the town in the early evening with his hands in his pockets, and the cold October air doing the work that cold air does when you have returned somewhere and are not entirely sure you had the right to. He heard about her from Mrs. Calloway at the post office, who mentioned her the way people in small towns mention things they believe you already know. "Nora's doing well," she said. "That nursery of hers is something. You should see the south end of Clement Street now." He stopped. "Nursery?" Mrs. Calloway looked at him with the particular patience of a woman who has watched a great many people fail to pay attention to things they should have. "Plants," she said. "She grows things. Has for about 6 years now. The whole south block, practically." He walked to Clement Street. The nursery occupied what had been a vacant lot and the 2 properties adjoining it. It was not a casual operation. Rows of cultivated plants in various stages of growth ran the length of the space, organized with a precision that was immediately recognizable to anyone who understood that such precision did not arrive on its own. A hand-lettered sign above the entrance read simply, "Voss and Ground." He stood at the entrance for a long moment, then he went back to the inn and did not sleep well. He saw her the following morning. He had not planned it, or rather, he had half-planned it, in the way people half-plan things they need to do, but have not yet located the courage for. Arriving at Clement Street early enough to suggest accident, and late enough to make it plausible that she would be there. She was carrying a flat of seedlings from the greenhouse when she saw him. She did not drop them. She did not slow her step in any way that another person would have noticed. She set the flat down on the long wooden table that ran the length of the nursery's central path, straightened, and looked at him. Nora Voss at 32 looked like a woman who had spent the intervening decade becoming more entirely herself. Her hair was shorter. There was a steadiness in the way she held her body that had not been there before, or perhaps had always been there, and he had not had the eyes for it. She was wearing a canvas work apron over a dark sweater, and her hands, he noticed, were the hands of someone who worked with the earth daily and had made peace with what that meant. She looked at him with an expression he recognized. Not the same as the one at the door 10 years ago, but related to it. A willingness to see things clearly and let them be what they were. Cole, she said. Not a question, Nora. He found, after 10 years of constructing things he might say to her, that he had arrived at her name and nothing beyond it. You look the same, she said, with a tone that meant she was noting a fact, not paying a compliment. Come to visit family. Came back, he said. Permanently, I think. Something moved through her expression, brief and controlled. That's a significant decision. It is. She picked up the flat of seedlings and moved to the next table. She did not invite him to follow, which meant nothing, and he followed anyway, because 10 years had taught him at minimum that waiting for permission had a cost. I heard about the nursery, he said. Most people have by now. She set the seedlings down with the practiced efficiency of someone who has performed this motion several thousand times. 6 years ago, I decided I needed something to tend. It turned out I was reasonably good at it. More than reasonably, he said. She looked at him. You've been here 12 hours, Cole. Mrs. Calloway is thorough. Something crossed her face that might, in different circumstances, have been the beginning of a smile. She returned to the seedlings. What do you want? She said, not unkindly. With the same quality she'd always had, the one that asked the actual question instead of circling it until it collapsed from neglect. He had prepared for many versions of this conversation. He had not prepared adequately for her directness, which was its own kind of answer to what had been missing in him when he left. To understand if I made a mistake, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, you did make a mistake. That's not really a question. I know that. The question, she said, is what you think understanding it now is supposed to do. He did not have an immediate answer. She had not expected one, or did not show that she had, which in Nora Voss amounted to the same thing. She finished what she was doing with the seedlings and moved to the next row, and he stood in the morning light of the nursery she had built from a vacant lot and tried to locate the right thing to say inside himself. He found instead the truth, which was sometimes the only thing left when the right thing could not be found. I left because I was afraid, he said. Not of you. Of being the kind of man who stayed somewhere small and called it enough. She had her back to him. She didn't turn. And now, she said. Now I've spent 10 years in places that weren't small, he said. And I understand that size has nothing to do with it. She turned. She looked at him with the direct, unhurried attention that had always been the most unnerving thing about her, the feeling of being seen without any of the usual social softening that people offered each other to make seeing bearable. I didn't wait for you, she said. I want you to be clear about that. I built this. She gestured at the nursery, at the rows of careful growth that the 6 years of tending made visible. I built this for myself. Not while waiting, not despite waiting. I simply stopped waiting and started building. I know, do you? Yes, he said. That's part of why I came back. She studied him for a long moment. The morning light was coming in at a low angle, the particular gold of early October, and the nursery smelled of soil and green things and the cool edge of the coming season. He stood in it and let her look, because she had always needed to see things clearly before she moved. And he had, 10 years ago, not given her the time. You can't return to something that isn't there anymore, she said finally. The people we were don't exist, I know that too. Then what are you asking? He thought about it. Seriously, the way she'd always asked him to think about things without rushing to the comfortable answer. I'm asking if there's something worth starting, he said. Not returning to. Starting. From here, she did not answer that morning. He had not expected her to, And the fact that he understood this, that he could read her well enough to know she would not be rushed and should not be, was perhaps the first evidence that 10 years had taught him something after all. He found work at the Greyfall lumber yard, which needed an operations manager, and did not ask too many questions about why a man would return to a town like this after a decade away. He rented a house on the north end of Clement Street. Practical, as it turned out, for reasons that hadn't occurred to him when he chose it, since the north end of Clement and the south end were separated only by the length of a block and the width of 6 years of her work. He did not seek her out again immediately. He let the town have him back at its own pace. The nods from people who remembered, the questions from people who didn't know better, the quiet accumulation of ordinary days, that is the only real proof that you have returned somewhere rather than simply visited. He saw her twice that week without intention. Once at the post office. Once on the river trail, where they had once walked, and where she now walked alone with the easy stride of a woman who had made her own company sufficient. Both times they exchanged words that were brief and unremarkable, and contained, underneath their surface, everything that was still unresolved. She did not make it easy. He had not expected her to. What he had not expected was that she would make it fair, which was a different and considerably more difficult thing. On the third week, she came to him. He was sitting on the front steps of the rented house in the early evening with cup of coffee and the week's paperwork when he heard her steps on the path. He recognized them. Another thing 10 years had not quite managed to take from him. She sat on the step beside him without being invited, which he noticed and did not mention. "I've been thinking about what you said," she said. "I've been thinking about it too." You said, starting, not returning. She looked at the street, not at him. "I've been trying to decide whether that's a meaningful distinction or a careful use of language. I spent a long time using language carefully," he said, "to avoid saying things. I'd rather say things now, even if I say them wrong." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm not the same person, neither am I. I'm not sure the person I am now would have fallen in love with the person you were." That landed the way true things land, with a weight that is not punishment, but is not comfortable either. "I'm not sure she would have either," he said. Nora looked at him then. Really looked, with the same full attention she had given things in the nursery, the seedlings, the soil, the slow, patient work of deciding what deserved care. "I'm not offering anything," she said. "I want to be precise about that. I know. I'm saying I'm willing to find out if there's something here worth the time it would take." She looked back at the street. "I don't do things slowly, and I don't do things carelessly, and if at any point I decide it isn't worth it, I will tell you directly. That's all I'm asking." "No," she said. "You asked for a start, that's what this is. Don't mistake it for more." She stood. "There's a harvest event at the nursery on Saturday. I could use an extra set of hands if you don't have anything." It was not a grand offer. It was 2 cups of coffee on a flat rock, she at a cabin door, offered without ceremony, acknowledging presence without making theater of it. "I'll be there," he said. She walked back down the path through the early October dark, and he sat on the steps with his coffee going cold, and the paperwork forgotten, and looked at the street of the town he had returned to, and felt, for the first time, that returning and arriving might not be the same thing, and that arriving, when it finally happened, had a weight to it that no amount of leaving could have predicted. He showed up Saturday with his sleeves rolled and no expectations he was willing to name. She put him to work immediately, moving flats and hauling compost and doing the physical, unglamorous labor of a harvest event without instruction or ceremony. He worked without complaint, which she noticed, and without requiring direction, which she noticed more. At midday she handed him a water bottle and stood beside him in the shade of the greenhouse, and they looked out at the nursery full of people and plants and the particular energy of something that had been built and was now in full function. "You built this well," he said. "I built it correctly," she said. "Well is something you find out over time." He looked at her. "How do you find out?" "You tend it," she said, "and you pay attention. And you don't walk away when it needs something you weren't prepared to give." She wasn't only talking about the nursery. He didn't say so. he didn't need to. That was the thing about Nora Voss. She said what she meant. And she meant what she left unsaid in equal measure, and learning to hear both had taken him 10 years, and the willingness to come back and admit it. The following months moved the way real things move. Without drama, without announcement, in the slow and honest accumulation of chosen days. He learned the rhythm of the nursery the way she had built it. Methodically, from the ground up, asking questions when he didn't understand, and not pretending when he did. She learned the changed version of him in the same way she learned most things, by paying more attention to what he did than to what he said, and filing away what she found without rushing to conclusions. Rapport. They argued, because they were both people who held opinions with both hands and did not let go simply because someone pushed. The arguments were honest, and occasionally sharp, and always, eventually, resolved. Not because either of them surrendered, but because they had both learned, in their different ways, that being right was considerably less valuable than being understood. She did not say she loved him. Not in the early months, not when it might have been easy to say, simply to say it. When she said it finally, on a still November evening at the south end of the nursery, with the last light sitting low on the remaining plants, she said it the way she did everything that mattered. Without decoration, without rehearsal, looking straight at him with the full weight of what she meant. He said it back the same way. He had learned, finally, how to do that. They did not marry quickly. Nora was not a woman who did things quickly to satisfy the expectations of a town that had watched her build a life without requiring its permission. When they did marry, it was on a Saturday in early May, in the nursery surrounded by 6 years of her work in full spring bloom, with with her father, the old veterinarian who had long since stopped asking questions about what his daughter needed, and started simply watching her have it. Standing beside her with an expression that was equal parts pride and the particular humility of a man who has understood something too late and is grateful it wasn't entirely too late. Cole held her hands at the ceremony and looked at her the way he had learned, through absence and return, and the slow, honest work of being present, to look at things he intended to keep. After the wedding, she expanded the nursery's east wing. He built the shelving for it over 3 weekends with borrowed tools and more care than the task technically required. She watched him work from the greenhouse doorway once and didn't say anything, which from Nora Voss was the loudest form of approval. The first year they were married, she planted a tree on the south slope, an oak. Slow growing, she said when he asked about it. Takes 20 years to show what it will become. He looked at her. That's a long investment. Yes, she said, and smiled the real one, not the careful version, and went back to her work. He stood in the May light of the nursery she had built from a vacant lot and a decade of choosing herself, and watched her tend it, and understood, with the full weight of someone who has spent 10 years learning the difference between leaving and losing, that some things were worth coming back to, not because they had waited, but because they had grown. Outside, the south slope was green and full of new things. The oak was small yet barely a sapling, but it had rooted, and in Greyfall, in the long memory of a town that kept people whether they intended it or not, that was enough.